have writer, broadcaster, scientist, lecturer in biology and society, president of Humanists UK, and all-round awesome human being, Adam Rutherford. So please welcome Adam to the stage.
Thank you. Yes, I am not Bobby Duffy, so sorry about that, because his talk sounded dead interesting. Andrew and Ian asked me to step in yesterday, and then Andrew made me drink until 2 o'clock in the morning in the hotel bar, at which point I went to bed and wrote this talk, and then I got up at 7:30 and rewrote this talk. So this is as a stand-in. There will be elements to this talk that many of you have heard before. Last year, my first conference as president, I talked about Nazis and eugenics, and I was banned from talking about horrible people. So as your undemocratically appointed president, which seems to be a theme of this conference, I'm going to talk about a subject that I've wheeled out. I haven't been doing talks about family histories and family trees for a while now, but apologies if you've heard some of this before. But I'm also going to be talking about undemocratically elected people. The idea of this talk, which comes from my book, A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lives, is that the main metaphor we use for describing life on Earth and families is trees. So the tree of life, family trees, pedigrees, and I'm here to describe 5 family trees which cover the entirety of life on Earth, and I'm going to show you that all of them are wrong, and all family trees are terrible ways of describing biology and families. So the first one is the tree of life itself. We've described life on Earth as a tree since the Darwinian era. That image, the most beautiful data visualization, I think, in the history of science, Darwin's first sketch of the process of evolution by natural selection in tree form from his notebooks in 1837. It's a wonderful artifact and piece of science communication from that era, and we should all love it. I imagine there's people in this room that have that as a tattoo. If you Google Darwin Tree of Life and tattoo, hundreds of people have it. It's very lovely. Now, that was 1837, 4 years ago. The most recent up-to-date Tree of Life, which is based not on morphology, but on genetics. And you see, it's like this, and it's deliberately modeled to look like the Darwinian version. And this describes all life that has been described so far, which is about 1.8 to 2 million species, which we estimate is probably about 10% of the total number of species that are on Earth extant today. The little blue dots are interesting facets of this tree of life because they're species that have been identified not by actually finding the species themselves, but by finding genes that are unique to what is presumed to be an individual species. So the whole idea of the tree of life has been utterly transformed in the last few years by genetics, and this is what it looks like. Except it doesn't look like this at all, because most life on Earth is bacteria, or their cousins, the archaea. We belong to this little short branch down at the bottom, the eukaryotes, and we're somewhere in here. There's about 5,000 species of mammals, but there's more than 1.7 million species of bacteria. By mass, by number, by longevity, almost all life on Earth is in fact bacteria in this branch here. Now, bacteria do something that most other life forms can't do, which is that we only pass our genes down from parent to child in a linear way, whereas bacteria can swap their genes with effectively their siblings. So they can just open up a hole in their cell walls and pass genes from individual to individual. That's one of the reasons why we have an antibiotic resistance crisis to this day. Now, that, if we put at the beginning of the origin of life here, the fact that bacteria are capable of doing this, what the tree of life actually looks like is this. right? Which is, I don't know whether any of you are keen gardeners, but that doesn't look like a tree to me at all. So there you go, there's the tree of life. It isn't a tree at all, but a tangled bush. And that's the totality of life on Earth. So let's skip forward about 4 billion years and go to the tree of human life. Now, we try to represent human evolution often in various forms, and one of the most famous is this one, which is the March of Progress, designed by the artist Rudolf Zallinger in 1965 for an issue of Time magazine, an offshoot of Time magazine. You all recognize this, yes? Yeah. I hate this picture. This is the worst example of science communication that exists, and it's become so popular. It's wrong for multiple reasons, but 2 key reasons that betray that this is not how evolution works. The first is the implication that there is a direction to our evolution. Evolution is blind and there is no direction. But here we have small monkeys growing into bigger monkeys, growing into primates, growing into eventually what becomes inevitably a white man carrying a spear. Now, you probably know from my other work that being white and human is an anomaly. It's a statistical sampling error. So why the direction of evolution should end up with a white man is a bit beyond me. I also dislike the fact that in all of these versions of these pictures, he is walking with his right leg forward, so you can't see the actual ingredients by which biological transformation occurs. It just seems unnecessarily prudish. Now, what was the other thing I hate about this picture? Oh yeah, the other thing is it implies sophistication. It implies that the direction of evolution is increased sophistication and intelligence, which of course is definitely not the case. So this is an absolute misrepresentation of how human evolution works. It's not linear, it doesn't have a direction, and it doesn't result in white man intelligence. This is the latest version of how we now are beginning to think about human evolution. This is unpublished, actually, so this is the first time this has been shown in public by a colleague of mine, a friend of mine, down in Brighton. Now, annoyingly, because this is the first time this has been shown, I've switched directions. This is time in the past, and this is time today. But what you can see, the blue areas is most of the species that we class as in the genus as Homo, so the humans, which includes Homo sapiens, but also Homo naledi and Homo neanderthalensis and Ergaster and rudolfensis and maybe about a dozen other Homos, of which we are the only remaining species. But what you can see is it's a sort of rivulet version of streams running down through time and into the current era, and the ones that touch this line here are extant humans. One species left, or when previously there were 9, 10, or maybe up to 20, according to some estimates. Now, a simplified version of that, and again, apologies for this, I wrote this talk at 2 o'clock last night when I was half cut. I'm going to reverse the direction of time again. So this is an ultra-simplified version, and here we have roughly 1 million years ago. Here we have in yellow extant humans broken up into large geographical groups, Asians, Europeans, and Africans. We also have an earlier branch of Homo sapiens that migrated out of Africa about 200,000 years ago, but is now extinct and has no living descendants. And of course, we also know about the Neanderthals, which we now broadly split into the Eastern Neanderthals and the Western Neanderthals. Neanderthals are primarily a Eurasian species. We find them as far east as almost into what is now Russia, and we find them as far west as probably Wales, but definitely Gibraltar, where we think the last of the Neanderthals died about 40,000 years ago. But this whole picture radically changed 10 years ago with the discovery of one tooth and this distal tip of the little finger of a teenage girl found in a cave in Siberia. The cave is called Denisova, so the designation of this individual is the Denisovans. And an interesting side note, you've probably heard of the Denisovans, right? So the latest branch in human evolution. The cave is called Denisova because a Christian eremite called Denis lived there. I just like that little fact. But the point about this is that a single bone from a little finger is not enough to designate a new species according to morphological criteria, which is how we define species. But because of the advent of ancient DNA, our ability to extract DNA from individuals and creatures that have been dead for tens or hundreds of thousands of years, because we can get the DNA out of these ancient specimens, we now could tell immediately that this teenage girl was not Homo sapiens and was not Homo neanderthalensis, and not a Neanderthal, but something else. So we put the Denisovans on this chart at the top now. Now, the other interesting facet of having ancient DNA as a new tool in understanding human evolution is that we can answer questions about how individuals and species interacted with each other. Now, interacted is a euphemism that we use in genetics. We talk about gene flow events. Genetics really is only about talking about sex and making it as boring as possible. So we talk about gene flow events, what we actually mean is sex. And when we sequence the genome of Homo neanderthalensis, one of the Gibraltar specimens, and the genome of the Denisovan girl, and our living, the genomes of living Homo sapiens today, what we found is that these dotted lines represent the gene flow events that have happened in the past. And we see that the Western Neanderthals had gene flow events with the people who evolved into Asians and Europeans. The Western Neanderthals did it also with the Europeans. The Eastern Neanderthals with the archaic modern humans. The Denisovans did it with the Asians. And the Denisovans also did it with the Eastern Neanderthals. Now, when I was describing this in that book, A Brief History, a few years ago, we like to use metaphors and analogies to help explain these sort of complex ideas. And I was really struggling to come up with a decent phrase for it. I missed one out, sorry. I've got one more to say, which is that another brilliant bit of science that emerged from this as well is that if you compare the genomes of the Denisovans with the Neanderthals with the Homo sapiens with us, there's kind of a gap. They don't quite add up. And so from that, we infer the existence of a phantom human, a human species that we have no physical remains for, but we know that they must have existed because we can find their DNA in living species today. So this whole picture has become enormously complicated. And as I was just saying a minute ago, you struggle to find a way to describe this because this is definitely not a tree. And the phrase that I've decided to go for is a 1 million year clusterfuck. I haven't managed to get that into a peer-reviewed paper yet, but I'm working on it. Right, so that's all of human evolution in about 1 million years worth of human evolution. We are a species which does two things extraordinarily well. We migrate and we fuck. All right. Now, another aspect of my work which I'm really interested in is how genetics has become a useful tool not just in evolutionary history but also in modern history. So how we can apply this new source, a text, a historical text that we all carry within us, how can we apply that to understanding modern history, and early modern history in fact. And that's been a complete revolution in the last 10 years or so due to the fact that we're just better at sequencing DNA, we're better at extracting it from dead people, we're better at understanding how it works in living people. And so the next three trees are versions of history which we've reanalyzed using contemporary genetic and genealogical data. And the first, again, I'm sure many of you will know this story overall, but my third tree is that of King Charles II, and I don't mean the English King Charles II, I mean Carlos the second, the Habsburg king, who died in 1700. Now, Carlos had an extremely troubled life. He didn't learn to walk until he was about 4. He didn't learn to talk until he was about 8. He was profoundly physically and mentally disabled. And he had what you'll recognize is that what's commonly referred to as the Habsburg jaw, the Habsburg lip, which we now call a prognathous jaw in medical terms. But his tongue was so swollen and fat in his mouth that he was incapable of retaining food or water in his mouth as he ate or drank. And so on his throne, as a teenager, he had a little semicircular curtain in front of his face so his dribbling food would not upset the courtiers. So he was profoundly disabled and lived a difficult life. His courtiers gave him a nickname, El Hechizado, the Hexed, or the Bewitched. Now, that Habsburg jaw, which we regard as quite ugly, was really a badge of honor for that family. It was a mark of their divinity. And it was the thing, or the characteristic, that they tried to keep within their family as a mark of this dynastic, unearned power. Here are some of the other Habsburgs. There's Charles, top left, that's his dad, Philip IV of Spain, various other members of the family, don't know what this guy is doing, and this gentleman is his aunt. And so when we think about family trees, you remember that everyone has two parents, which means the number of ancestors you have doubles every generation you go back through time. Now, Charles's bewitching, his hex, was a result of many, many generations of inbreeding in an attempt to maintain that chin and that power in the Habsburg family, the most powerful family in Europe for more than 2 centuries. Every single Holy Roman Emperor had come from that one family, and the Habsburgs ruled the largest chunk of Europe at that time. But it ended with Charles because he died at the age of 39 in 1700 without leaving an heir, and what followed was the Spanish Wars of Succession. Now remember that family tree. If you go 7 generations back, you should have 256 people on your family tree. This is a standard depiction of a family tree. That's you at the bottom, and there's all your ancestors going 7 generations back. If you're fully outbred, 256 people should be on that family tree. I'm from Suffolk. Now just bear that in mind, 256 people. This is what Charles II's family tree looked like. Yeah, quite. There are 29 people on his family tree going back. Well, we can't even say how many generations it is really, because most of the inbreeding events here are between uncles and nieces. So what we see is that, for example, if you look at Charles II at the bottom there, his father is Philip IV of Spain, which means his grandfather and grandmother, Philip III of Spain and Margarita of Austria. But if you go via his maternal ancestry, what you see is that Mariana of Austria via Maria Anna and Ferdinand III also gets to Philip III and Margarita of Austria, which means that Philip III and Margarita are simultaneously Charles's grandparents and great-grandparents. This is what we refer to in genetics as suboptimal. I mean, basically, family trees should never have loops in them, whereas if you look carefully at this, this is only loops. And if you track it back, this pedigree starts with the mating of Philip of Castile, Philip the Handsome, he was known as, to Joanna of Castile. Now, Joanna of Castile lived a troubled life as well. It's very difficult to diagnose people posthumously, certainly many centuries ago, but it was many descriptions of her indicate that she had pretty severe mental health issues through her life, and her courtiers gave her an unkind nickname, but I feel like this is enough distance that I can actually say it. She was known as Joanna la Loca, the Mad. And if we trace back one lineage from Charles via Philip, via Philip, via Philip, via Isabella, you get to Philip. Right? That's one pathway. But remember I said there are loads of loops in this, because you can also go via this loop here. And if you go on the maternal line, you go one Ferdinand, Maria Anna, Renata, Francis, Christian, but you can also go, well, basically, there are 9 different routes you can get from Charles II to Joanna la Loca, which means that she occupies 9 different positions that should be filled by 9 individual women, and she exists on 3 different tiers, 3 different generations of this family tree. Now, this is profound inbreeding, probably the worst example of inbreeding in a well-established pedigree that we know of. And all of it was in order to ensure power, to maintain the grip of power from this family. But with a 17th century understanding of genetics, it had literally the opposite effect. in genetics we have a measure for inbreeding. So if you remember that you inherit half of your chromosomes from your mother and half from your father, and those chromosomes contain the same genes, but they can be slightly different. So you get 2 sets of all of your genes. And there's a mechanism of inheritance, which we talk about dominant and recessive inheritance. In order to have a trait which is described as recessive, you need to have 2 copies that are identical. So blue eyes, broadly, is a recessive trait, which means you have to have 2 versions of the blue-eyed gene in order to have blue eyes. Now, the inbreeding coefficient, which is the official metric of measuring inbreeding, is an attempt to quantify how similar the genes on your maternal chromosomes are from your paternal chromosomes, right? And ideally, you want to be as outbred as possible so that all of those pairs of genes are as different as possible to each other. If a brother and a sister were to successfully have a child, right, with 50% of their genes being the same, coming from the same parents, if the brother and the sister were to have a child, then their inbreeding coefficient would be 0.25, so a quarter of their genes would be identical on one chromosome to the other. And that's bad because it means the possibility of recessive diseases emerging is highly likely because a quarter of all their genetic material is the same. When in 2014 we calculated the inbreeding coefficient for Charles El Hechizado, it came out as 0.254. So just over more inbred than if a brother and a sister have a family. So this type of inbreeding is obviously devastating for families. And it's a really interesting interplay between the fundamental biology of genetics and inheritance and geopolitics, because what happened as a result of this inbreeding was the collapse of the most powerful empire in Europe. So inbreeding, really bad for families, absolutely brilliant for geneticists. I don't know. Sorry, I don't know how that's like. I thought that was funny at 2 o'clock last night. I can't seem to get off this slide now, it's stuck. All right, tree 4. Who do you think you are? Now, again, you probably heard this story before, and it's one that I love telling, and this is from my book, How to Argue with a Racist. But the program, Who Do You Think You Are, which I think is just terrific TV. It's where you get B-list celebrities to go back through classical genealogy and find out that they inevitably have, well, if they're a woman, they tend to have a chambermaid in their ancestry, and if they're a man, they tend to have either a lord or a rapist. That just seems to be the model for Who Do You Think You Are. It's very good TV. The specific episode that I want to refer to here features this man, Danny Dyer, which broadcast a few years ago, and it was being shown at the time I was writing this book. Oh yeah, so I decided, again, this was a 2 o'clock edit last night, because it's you know who Danny Dyer is? Sort of Cockney wanker actor. I've never seen him in anything, but highly entertaining, so I changed the name to Who Do You Think You Are, You Slag? Maybe I should write all my talks at 2 o'clock in the morning when I'm drunk. Anyway, so Andrew is shaking his head. So I don't know whether you saw this program, but it was a very, very funny version of this program where this working class boy from born in Canning Town, who's about as Cockney as an actor can be, and during the course of this program, using traditional forms of genealogy, managed to trace his ancestry in a direct line, a proper paper trail, which demonstrated that he was 22 generations directly descended from Edward III, the Plantagenet king. And what a cool thing that is, to actually be shown that you're descended from Edward III. Danny Dyer's reaction was threefold, and I was watching this program, I noted at the time because I thought it was brilliant. He said, "I need to get it in my nuts, then move on with my life." He then said, "I'm going to treat myself to a massive ruff." Now, interestingly, ruffs didn't become fashionable until about the 17th century, so that's, historically inaccurate Daniel. But he also said, "My blood is his blood. I can't compute it in my brain." The "my blood is his blood" stuff forms a significant chapter in How to Argue with a Racist, because it questions what it means to have inheritance down direct lineages, and what that what we culturally think of as being in bloodlines. But that wasn't the bit that I was interested in at that time, because he then said, I can't compute it in my brain. And I was sitting there thinking, well, I do population genetics at UCL. That's my literal job. I wonder if I can compute it using my brain. And the answer to that was yes. So I set up a mini project over the course of a weekend with a couple of colleagues, and we attempted to work out the probability that anyone is descended from Edward III, who was born in the 1970s, right? Danny Dyer was born in 1977, I was born in 1975. So stage one of that process was counting the number of descendants that Edward III actually had. And it took about 2 days to do this, and we worked out that after 2 generations, he had about 321 direct descendants. After that point, it becomes difficult to account for them all because the family tree just dissipates. 321 is a very reasonable, it's a large-ish number, but there's a very high likelihood that some of you in this room will have 321 great-great-grandchildren, especially the good-looking ones. So then you add another factor on top of that, which is an assumption, a conservative assumption that all of those would have had, on average, 2 children. So you get to a point which is by 1600, our estimates were that Edward III had 20,544 descendants. We applied various degrees of freedom and various different methods for working out this calculation. The basic idea was to work out how many living descendants Edward III has at a certain point in time, in this case 1600, and then ask the question how many ancestors any individual born in the 70s would have had in the same year. And comparing those 2 numbers gives you an answer to the probability that you are descended from Edward III. You know where this is going. The British population at this time was about 4.2 million, so which means that the estimate is that 1 in 210 people in 1600 were direct descendants of Edward III. Now, if you work backwards under the premise that everyone has 2 parents, everyone who's ever lived has had 2 parents, with the possible exception of Jesus. So, you know, I never normally make that joke, but I figured in this audience it would land. So apart from JC, you have, in the year 1600, with an average generational time of 25 years, which is what we use standardly in genetic genealogy, any individual born in the 1970s will have approximately 32,768 ancestors. And 5% of the population at that time are direct descendants of Edward III. So the question is, are any of your 32,000 ancestors in the year 1600 in the 5% of the population that are direct descendants from Edward III? There's various ways we make this calculation. We use a binomial distribution and a Bernoulli trial, 32,000 Bernoulli trials if you really want to know. Well, the answer comes out as there is a 0% chance that you are not descended from Edward III. So there are some caveats to this. I mean, this is a very conservative estimate. We did a liberal estimate, and basically it came out as the chances of you not being descended from Edward III are 10 to the minus 21. Now, some of the caveats to that are that I'm broadly talking about anyone who has any significant British ancestry. So if, for example, you are from the recent African diaspora, then it is much less likely that you have an ancestor in 1600 in the 5% of the population. But nevertheless, it's not the most diverse room in the world, we have to say. Almost everyone in this room has a 100% chance of being descended from Edward III. And in fact, we worked it out even more accurately. The chances are that every living English white person has a maximum of 131 ancestors who are directly descended from Edward III. And again, I was struggling how to describe this, but I decided to go with that. Because that's actually really how, this is an important point, this is how genealogy and family trees actually work. They're not trees at all. We draw those beautiful branching trees and pedigrees in order to see an idealized version of people having 2 parents and 4 grandparents and 8 great-grandparents. But people die and remarry, and they have affairs, and they do all sorts of things and move around, which means that our family trees are not trees at all, but tangled bushes. And what we find is that there are no direct lineages that are pure lines. All of the genealogy that you do where people say, well, I'm descended directly from Edward III or whoever, well, so is everyone. So, big deal. It means absolutely nothing. It makes good TV, but it really means nothing about you and about your status and about immigration or your citizenship. All of those things are just lost in time like tears in the rain. So 100% chance that you're descended, if you're of largely British ancestry, from from Edward III. No. No one's descended from Danny Dyer, apart from his children. Does he have children? How do you know that? I was expecting more erudition from this audience, to be perfectly honest. All right, but we can do better than that in genetics. When we look at family trees, we apply model theories and mathematical tests and now genetic tests to really understand how families work over multiple generational times. Because we want to understand our position in this universe and the complexities of lived lives and where we fit into this entirely messy picture. People are obsessed with genealogy. It is the most popular pastime in America, and the second most popular pastime in the UK after... Nope. Who said sex? No, not fishing. Third. What? Gardening. There it is. Gardening and genealogy. There's the British people. But my fifth and final tree is an attempt to explain how ancestry really works. And it involves the first Holy Roman Emperor, Charlemagne, Carlos Magnus, one of the few kings given the title the Great European conciliator. So born, we think, either in Belgium or France in 742, and was one of the great power brokers of that period, including unifying many of the European states of that time. Now, because he's one of the earliest European kings and the first European Holy Roman Emperor, we know his family tree well. We know his direct lineage from Charlemagne into the present. And that is a big sort of fillip. It's a big kudos for people who are interested in genealogy, because if you can trace your family tree and get to Charlemagne, then that's a cool thing to have on your family tree. Most people's family trees peter out after a few generations, and there is very little evidence that your ancestors ever existed apart from in your genes. But we know that Charlemagne has living descendants today because people have demonstrated it. One particular family, the Bacadurks, have traced the family tree from Charlemagne all the way to them. So he has living descendants today. This is a bit of the family tree which actually only goes up to the 14th century. Other people have claimed this lineage. 4 kudos points. Richard Branson on the left issued a press release a few years ago saying he'd done his family tree and he's descended from Charlemagne. Christopher Lee, the great Count Dooku, Jedi, Dracula actor, he was the son of an Italian countess, and they knew their family tree, and he also was descended directly from Charlemagne. There's a really neat story within this as well, which is there was one character, when we were going through this family tree a few years ago, I spotted a guy called Joachim Neumann, a German priest from Dusseldorf. And he has this is a total side note, but a lovely, lovely piece of trivia, and it would be the only thing you remember from this talk. Joachim Neumann used to go out to a set of caves outside of Dusseldorf in order to meditate and think about whatever 18th century priests thought about. And as part of this process, he decided to turn his name, Neumann, into a Greek version of his name as tribute to his intellectual forebears. So he turned Neumann, new man, into a Greek version, which is Neander. The bit outside Dusseldorf in which he died was a valley, a cave, which was named after him, Neanderthal. So the naming of the species Neanderthal comes from this great lineage because Joachim Neander changed his name to the Greek. It's a little cul-de-sac, it's not relevant at all. there's your standard issue family tree. I've shown you already, 8 generations, 256 people. So 4 times that means that there are 1,000 people. So 4 individuals, if you go back 8 generations or 7 generations, which is 25 years each, so into the middle of the 19th century, 4 people will have roughly 1,000 ancestors. If you do 100 people, so the first, 10 rows or so, that means the number goes up to about 900,000. 100 people living today have 900,000 ancestors in the middle of the 19th century, because everyone has 2 parents. Now, you can't keep doing this. If you double the number of ancestors you have every generation back through time, by the time you get to 40 generations ago, which is 1,000 years into the past, the number of ancestors that an individual, one person has, is that number, just over 1 trillion. Now that's 10 times more people than have ever existed. We estimate about 107 billion people have existed on Earth. So there's a massive mathematical conundrum in there. How can you have more ancestors than people who've ever existed only 1,000 years in the past? Well, the answer is obvious, really. It's that we have that many positions on our family trees 1,000 years ago, but they're occupied by the same people many, many times over, because we are fundamentally a very inbred species. So this is obvious when you think about it, because first cousins don't have 256 times 2 ancestors. They have shared ancestors from their grandparents onwards. So all of those people in the yellow box in the middle are shared ancestors as 2 first cousins. So the number doesn't simply double the number of ancestors, it is double minus the number of shared ancestors. And that's just first cousins in the current generation. What we're interested in genetics is modeling whole populations so that we understand where that shared ancestry comes from. And one way of doing this is by looking at a concept called the most recent common ancestor, MRCA. So the most recent common ancestor of 2 first cousins is a grandparent, right? Make sense? Yeah. But we're not interested in individual families and genetics, we're interested in populations. And when we calculate the most recent common ancestor, for example, for the entire population of Europe, the number comes out as 1,400. So about 600 years ago, an individual, probably many individuals, existed through whom one branch of everyone in this room's family tree flows, an individual person. And this is a hypothetical person, but of course, and we can't trace who that person is, but that person did exist. But we can do better than that as well. And so let me introduce you to the brain-scrambling Sunday morning concept of the genetic isopoint, also known as the identical ancestors point. Now, you do need to concentrate here. I've talked about the isopoint 100 times, and I still find it utterly baffling. If you imagine your family tree has branches coming from you and going through time, but instead of continuing to branch out to form 1 trillion ancestors 1,000 years ago, what actually happens is it starts to straighten up. And you don't have that number of ancestors. In fact, a few generations back, you will find that a man or a woman will occupy multiple positions in your great-great-great-great generational chain. So you have fewer ancestors than you do positions on your family trees. Now, that's only a few generations back. We begin to see that. We see that all lines cross through an individual in the 15th century. But as you keep going back, there are fewer people alive in time, and there are more people alive than have ever lived today. So those numbers have to crash into each other, and what we find when we model these stats is that your ancestral lines begin to cross more and more frequently through individuals, until a time comes in the past, which we call the genetic isopoint, where all branches of all family trees cross through all living individuals at that time, right? I know this is a hard concept, so I'm going to explain it in 3 different ways. At the isopoint, it means that the entire population alive at that time are all the ancestors of the entire population alive at this time, if they have any children at all. Many of the people 1,000 years ago have no living ancestors, so they are the ancestors of, no living descendants, so they are the ancestors of no one alive today. But anyone who has living descendants today at the isopoint is the ancestor of everyone living today. And we've modeled this for Europe because we have the best data for it. Another way of explaining it, I've already said, is All branches of all family trees cross through all individuals. So you see your family tree coming out from you, and then it begins to straighten up, and then some lines begin to cross. And as you go back further through time, it crosses through every single individual alive at that time. Third one is, I've already said, if you were alive then you're either the ancestor of everyone today or no one today. This is what family trees really look like. These are mathematical simulations that we use in our work in population genetics to show what family trees look like. It's you down at the bottom, 2 parents, 4 grandparents, and as you go back, and this only goes back 15 generations, by the time you get 15 generations back, you see that every line just banks into each other, and you get a complete clash because all lines of ancestry flow through all people alive at that time if they have living descendants. Yes? Have you got that? That's the genetic isopoint. Now, when we calculate the genetic isopoint for the population, the living population of Europe today, the answer comes out as the 10th century, 1,000 years ago. So the population of Europe alive 1,000 years ago, if they have living descendants today, which we think is about 80% of them, then they are the ancestors of everyone living today. Yes? Now, who do we know from the 10th century who has living descendants today? Charlemagne! You got it. So if we can prove that he has living descendants today, which we have done, which means that he is the ancestor of the Bacadurks and Christopher Lee and Richard Branson and everyone in this room and every single European, which I find a very warming thought, and you may now treat yourself to a massive rough. And that's it. I think, that was pretty much exactly what Bobby Duffy was going to talk about, wasn't it? 100%.
Generation myths, yeah. That was fantastic. Thank you, Adam. We've got time for 2 questions and no more Danny Dyer impersonations. So can we go to this lady at the front here first, please?
Thanks. Sorry, it's a good game. Shakespeare.
Does he have living descendants? Yeah, he does. Tom Shakespeare is descendant. Yeah, sure. Why not?
Percentages.
You want me to do that now, live? That's only a weekend. Yeah, when Shakespeare was 16th century, probably Shakespeare has hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of living descendants today. But we fetishize that if you can demonstrate it. And so, people with the name Shakespeare, well, that's really cool. You're descended directly from Shakespeare. These great people from history is a method of us trying to identify our own position in the world and claiming some kudos from being descended from people that we literally have nothing to do with. And there's another aspect to this which I think is super interesting, which is that when people talk about bloodlines and they talk about purity, and racists love talking about how their ancestors have been in Britain for hundreds, if not thousands of years, this island, it's a fucking island. It didn't have any indigenous people. The earliest existence of humans on... Sorry about the swearing. I think we're past that though, aren't we? The earliest habitation of these isles was about 900,000 years ago, based on footprints found in Haysborough in Norfolk. 900,000 years ago. We don't even know what species those people were. We've been pretty much continually occupied and continually migrated into for the last 10,000 years. I've just demonstrated that everyone's descended from everyone 1,000 years ago. So all of those Twitter Burks who have George Crosses and names like Ethelstan, who say, I've traced my ancestry and it goes back to William the Conqueror. Yeah, cool. Literally everyone is the same. What's that? Well, that's a bit rude.
Gentleman in the blue t-shirt.
A couple of comments, I suppose, and a question later. You should definitely do 2 o'clock in the morning talks. There's definitely, there's no question about it. I just wondered if you could...
Specifically because I wasn't allowed to talk about Nazis, eugenics, or the history of scientific racism.
As I was listening to this, I hope this is useful. As I was listening to this, I was thinking, okay, so what do I do with this now? And I was thinking, is this where you want this to go? Because I was thinking, everyone's to do with everyone else, so I can try and move away from any kind of the oppression of bloodlines. I was thinking about monarchy. I was thinking about something that happened in my own family because I was adopted and someone said, oh, you can't inherit that because you haven't got the blood. And these are sort of normal people today being what they think of as normal. Yeah. So I just had to swallow that. And I just wondered what your takeaway was, because I think my takeaway is, in a non-religious sense, because this is a non-religious gathering, we are to do with everyone else in some sort of equalised way. Is that the right sort of takeaway?
Yes, I think it is. I think it is precisely right. It shows a number of different things. And this is, a lot of my humanism is derived from thinking about science, and that old Robin Ince joke, which is that reality tends to have a liberal bias. And the more I study human evolution and genetics and eugenics and race and see that these are non-scientific political ideologies that bastardize science or marshal new science into their existing ideologies, and the more we look at them and the more we study them, the more we find that they're just wrong. I mean, they're scientifically wrong as well as being morally grotesque as well. I don't want to sound all Carl Sagan-y. No, wait a minute, I do want to sound all Carl Sagan-y. And soft around the edges. But we are an incredibly closely related species, and the biological differences that we see are superficial and recent. And attempts to separate us using those biological criteria demonstrate an ignorance of how biology and families and evolution actually works. So I find it hard not to know those things as I've studied them for 30 years now and not come out of that with a humanist and liberal sensibility about our shared humanity. And the other thing is that, you're probably sitting next to your fourth cousin. You probably married your fourth cousin if you indeed did. Because that's how related we are. There's almost no doubt that there are people in this room who are fourth cousins and don't know it. Because fourth cousins is an absolute huge amount of distance in a family tree sense. But when you pay your £100 and spit in a test tube and send it off to Ancestry.com and it says, here are all your third and fourth cousins. Yeah, so what? I mean, it means absolutely nothing. I'm a geneticist and I spend most of my time saying how useless genetics is. It's not, but it just needs qualification.
Adam, thank you so much for that really informative and entertaining talk this morning, and thanks everybody for your time.